a big honor and probably also somewhat of a weight to be the final speaker of such an amazing conference. I've been peeking into some of the various things that have been happening over the days of the conference, and it looks like you guys were having a lot of fun. So obviously also what I'm here to do is to put a social science spin on things. So I will preface this by saying that I am not a techie person. I am more of a dabbler, and even though I'm really interested in digital media and privacy in particular as one of the kind of key tenets of people's existence in the hybrid media spaces, I am by no means a person who understands or professes to understand how algorithms work or how to write code. I do, however, have a keen interest in how people use technology, and this is what I'm going to talk about today. So the title of my talk is Each of Us is a Micromedia, and it's about citizen mobilization as media practices in the context of Russia's war in Ukraine. And the first part of the title comes from a tweet that one of my Ukrainian acquaintances posted on Twitter a few months ago when the war in Ukraine the full-fledged war was already very much underway. She posted the tweet and she said, look, each of us is a micromedia. We are here not just as Twitter users, but we're here to share information about the war. We're here to tell people about what's going on. And so that puts special responsibilities on active social media users. And it made me think about, how we think about what people do on social media during crises and especially military conflicts, because of course, social media use is something we do on a daily basis, and we tend to think about it as something routine. And there's a lot of research on routine uses of social media in everyday life. But increasingly, what we're also seeing is that there are certain moments when social media use becomes less anything but routine, and that usually tends to happen during, say, protests or during elections, or during natural disasters, and also during wars. And so I think it's really important to really focus our thinking about how we understand what happens to people's social media use, what happens to their perception of social media platforms and their affordances in these crisis moments, and how it changes what people do on social media and with social media. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And the context for this war, obviously, is for this talk is the war that Russia is waging in Ukraine. And to give you just a brief kind of bit of background, Russia first invaded Ukraine back in 2014, and it occupied the Crimean Peninsula in Ukraine and some land in eastern Ukraine. And so those territories have been occupied by Russian forces and pro-Russian forces since 2014. But the conflict started kind of as a military conflict, but then it sort of simmered, with minor confrontations. However, in February this year, since February 24th, Russia also started a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and it's been attacking various parts of Ukraine across the very, very large territory of Ukraine from the east to the west. And obviously a lot more territories are currently occupied, up to and including some large regional centers. So this has been going on since the end of February, so we're now in month 5 of the war. And so how we understand people's participation in conflicts and in this war obviously doesn't just stop at people taking up arms or soldiers fighting other soldiers in the field. What we now understand the quality of war to be is that it is very much also a type of participatory warfare, something that William Marin describes as a kind of warfare that offers opportunities for different kinds of participation and expands those opportunities. So very much this also involves participating through mediated means, not just in the traditional way where people watch the television news every night and look at what's happening and participate in that way, but also active participation, by sharing certain kinds of information, by using social media and other media to fundraise, for instance, for the war effort, or to call for justice when we're talking about war crimes and crimes against humanity. And Russia's war in Ukraine has very much been this kind of participatory war. And we already have some research that tells us that Ukrainian citizens in particular on a grassroots level have relied on the openness and power of existing horizontal networks in Ukrainian society to mobilize for collective action and to do so away from or alongside centralized authority. So this tradition exists in Ukrainian society and in the Ukrainian digital sphere for quite some time. These kind of grassroots horizontal networks and civil society connections have existed for a while because obviously there is a kind of history of protests in Ukraine, most notably the Euromaidan protests in 2013 and 2014, immediately after which the conflict started. And so these networks are very important because they don't remain the same. They change and new people come into the networks, but they are resilient exactly because they're more informal and they exist alongside centralized authority. So they're not dependent on government or state officials. It's actually quite the opposite. It's the government and the state officials in Ukraine have come to rely on these informal or some more, some less formal horizontal civic networks. Obviously, participatory wars are also characterized by high levels of digital and social media use and media activity. And in this war in particular, we have seen incredibly intense social media activity and digital media use by governments on both sides, and even by governments and other actors who are not actually, neither in Ukraine nor in Russia, but elsewhere. Also, these media are used by military actors, media outlets, and of course, ordinary citizens as well. And it's the citizens that I would really like to focus on today. So we know, right, there's opportunities for participation. We know that there's a high intensity of media use, but how do we think about understanding what the citizens actually do, when they become participants in the war, when they become participants in the war through the means offered by social media. And my suggestion here is that we think about understanding how citizens come together and mobilize in participatory war. That it's useful to think about it through the lens of media practices, which is a term that has been used in media studies and communication studies for quite some time and has even made its way into some adjacent disciplines such as social movement studies. And obviously internet studies as well. I think this term is useful because it allows us to better understand specifically how media, politics, and civic action intersect for citizens who are mobilizing through participating in conflicts and wars. And because we are dealing with trying to understand not just how they use a single platform or a single tool, but we want to understand the complex ecosystem of various tools and platforms that citizens use. Also accounting for the fact that citizens have different levels of digital literacy, and they have different levels of how keen of a user they are of a particular platform, how comfortable they are, and how these are used to support these activities that are often goal-oriented, and we'll talk about the goals in just a second, but sometimes they're targeted and strategic, and sometimes they're impromptu, and they're absolutely kind of on-the-spot things that people come up with in order to aid their mobilizing efforts. I think also media practices are useful because they don't just look at the macro-level processes. They don't just look at here's this transformation is occurring in society or something is happening on a large scale. But media practices allow us to really drill down and look at the agency of individuals and small communities, which arguably, as a social scientist, I think is a more productive approach compared to the prevailing turn of what we're seeing and how conflicts are studied, where people are looking at these geopolitical grand narratives. They're looking at wartime communication, disinformation and propaganda, media manipulation, and that's all useful and it's really important, and it's part of the picture, but what often gets missed is this really small-scale action and these small-scale activities and practices, which I think should and deserve to be also, be in the spotlight. So a little bit about the concept of media practices. Obviously, it originated on the one hand from media studies. On the other hand, it builds on earlier scholarship that looks at social practices of mobilization. So we have the social practices that have been studied for decades by social scientists looking at social movement organizations and protests, and we know some of the core social practices for mobilization. They're participation, movements or membership organizations, staging protests, engaging in other symbolic activities. So all of this knowledge exists already. But then we also have this other framework of media practices, which was originally suggested by Nick Coldry, which suggests that it's useful to understand media not just as channels of information or as platforms or as texts, but as practices, as a combination of practices, and to understand how media uses arrange, combine, and more generally intersect with other social practices. So we're not just looking at media in isolation or as platforms or as texts, but we're looking at them when they intersect with other social practices, in our case, right, mobilization and participation, and then how people use media both as consumers and as generators of media content to enhance those social practices. And it's also useful because media practice as a theory suggests that there are several different temporalities that we can look at media practices in. There's the long term, the medium term, and the short term. So we can look at transformations and changes in terms of different temporalities. What are some of the practices that happen on a daily basis? And then what are some of the transformations in media use and media production and media broadcasting that take place over time? And media practices are also useful because they suggest that we can look at several different levels, right? We can look at the macro level, which is the kind of geopolitical, media market, media system level, where changes happen, where freedom of speech becomes something that is under threat, and that changes the whole game. We can also look at meso level, so we can look at media organizations, we can look at independent journalism, we can look at open source intelligence efforts, so all different kinds of organizational actors that participate in the hybrid media system. But we can also look at the micro level, right? And this is the level that I'm particularly interested in. We can look at the media practices of individuals. And this very much aligns with what Alice Matoni and Emiliano Traore call activist media practices, right? So when they look at social movement studies, at particular ways that activists engaged with different media tools and platforms, they suggested that it's really useful to understand this micro level because it gives you an inkling of all of the different routinized and creative social practices that include interactions with media objects and that then generate or appropriate media messages and interactions with other media subjects to reach the specific goals that a certain activist collective or a certain social movement sets for themselves. So, this is the kind of framework that I'm applying when I'm looking at the activities and the media practices of Ukrainian citizens in the ongoing war. And it's really important here, right, that we're talking about routinized practices. So a lot of the practices that we will see, there's something that these people do on a daily basis anyway, and they've adapted them or changed them in order to serve the goals they've set for their participatory war effort. But they're also incredibly creative, and they always involve interactions with media objects, and in our case, most likely digital media objects, but also interactions with other individuals and other organizations that are part of participatory work. So media practices are also really useful as a concept because we can understand them not just as something that involves media use, but something that is also actively political, right? And really understanding that pretty much any citizen media or communicative practices in wartime, when people are joining this participatory warfare environment, all of these practices are necessarily political because as Natalie Fenton suggests, they actively re-socialize the political. So they take the political agenda from that macro level, from those messages that the governments are exchanging, and they bring it down to citizen level, to individual level, and re-socialize those political messages. What is important about understanding citizen individual media practices as politics is that they're also able very often, because it's a grassroots effort, to push against mainstream media logics and even platform algorithmic logics, right? So it's really important because very often when we talk about the mainstream media agenda, we can see certain patterns in how wars are covered that become, kind of boring and become, routine, and again, don't necessarily achieve the desired effect, right? Because there are certain media logics in how wars are reported, right? They're looking for explosions, they're looking for mass casualties, they're looking for pictures that will attract viewers, they're looking for conflict on a daily basis. But war also includes a lot of other things, right? And it's very hard for mainstream media to cover all of those things. And this is where citizen media come into play, and this is where citizen media practices are important. Platform algorithmic logics, I'm sure, is something that has come up throughout this year's conference. And we know how difficult it is to push through platform algorithmic logics because they have a lot of power into what content surfaces and what content becomes visible. And so part of the citizen media practices and part of their aim is also to push against those logics and to find ways to co-opt or subvert them in order to put through the messages that the citizens think are really important, or even to build alternative media and alternative platforms, which again is a tradition that has existed in indie media and alternative media for quite some time, and we're now seeing attempts for the same logics to be introduced in the hybrid media system and in the social media space. The biggest part about the political aspect of media practices in participatory warfare is that they are important because they bring the publics to the fore, and the aim is to center the public's voices and not the voices of the state or the voices of NATO or the voices of the UN, but the public's voices, and to report about the war and its effects on citizens and on individuals, which again, I think sounds like a very admirable goal. And part of the task that citizens set for themselves, right, is to report on the very real effects, everyday effects of the war on people, and to narrate histories of violence, to show that, this isn't just, this war didn't just start in February, didn't start 8 years ago, that there is a longer history of confrontation and violence here, and to draw connections between different events that may or may not be obvious to people who are not, for instance, Ukrainian citizens that have lived in the country for quite some time. So hopefully I've convinced you that this is a really useful concept, and that focusing on the individuals and focusing on the grassroots level is really important. So really, I want to just jump straight into what we can observe in the hybrid media space of Russia's war in Ukraine, and specifically what we can observe in what the citizens have been doing. Obviously, these observations are a work in progress, so they're not in any way systematic, but to the best of my ability, and as a Ukrainian, and therefore a person who's also involved in a lot of these activities, I have tried to kind of systematize and categorize some of my observations. So because citizens participating in war and involved in participatory warfare are very much mobilized citizens, we know that they interact with the media not just because they're audiences of media messages, so they're not just passively sitting there and consuming messages produced by traditional media organizations or governments, but they also produce media messages on a systematic and continuous basis, right? So in a way, they kind of become quasi-media professionals who are doing the work, or some of the work, that traditionally journalists or media practitioners do, but a lot of this work they do on a voluntary basis, so they're not paid for this. It is not something they learn to do or trained to do, but they do this work anyway. And this is where this comment about citizens being micro media it really, really resonates. So some of the things we've seen in the coverage of the war and how the war has been socialized on social media is that there is pervasive use of mobile technology. There is a lot of video, which is on the one hand very useful because there is a lot of evidence of what's happening and testimonies, but it also means that there's a lot of things to verify. We've also seen that the war has not just been visible in the digital realm, and so the media we have aren't just digital. They're also analog media, so there have been some reports of, say, posters going up on walls of buildings in occupied territories, spreading the news, because very often in occupied territories in Ukraine, people lose access to mobile connection, television, internet, they have no electricity. So it's also really important to understand that this isn't just a digital media space, it is a hybrid media space, and a lot of the messaging and the media work that's done transcends social media, transcends digital media, and a lot of it is less visible because it either happens in the darker corners or encrypted messengers or purportedly encrypted messengers like WhatsApp, Viber, and Telegram, and sometimes it's analog messaging that goes outside the digital realm. We've also seen that some of the efforts to engage in media practices are very much individual, but other efforts are community efforts. So for instance, we've had several initiatives that have been translating social media content that is published in Ukrainian or Russian. There are concerted efforts to translate this content and make it available in English. One example of this is a website called War Translated. I think the URL is wartranslated.org. And it's basically an effort that was started by an Estonian citizen who speaks Russian, who grew up in Estonia. And then he found other willing volunteers, where they translate content, from Twitter threads, Facebook posts, videos shared across social media platforms, just to basically increase the potential audience for these testimonies and these stories that are shared. And they've translated things like stories by people escaping Russian occupation, people going, having been forcefully deported to Russian territory from occupied Ukrainian territory, and then finding their way back to Ukraine somehow. So there's all sorts of stories that they're translating. One other thing they translate is they also translate comments under certain posts. Sometimes I think it's quite an eye-opener, for instance, to see the kinds of comments that Ukrainians post under a video of a shot-up Russian tank, or comments that Russian users post under videos of a city center in a Ukrainian town that has just been attacked and civilian infrastructure has been attacked. Some of those comments are quite vicious and vile, and so that they also see it as an important job to translate this work. Of course, one of the things that media practices do in this case, because they're not practiced, these things aren't practiced by professional journalists, and therefore citizens engaging in these practices are not necessarily bound by the same ethics of journalism, is that they normalize emotionality in media practices, right? Because obviously for citizens affected by the war, being emotional about it is an absolutely normal thing. But what we've seen in journalism studies is that increasingly emotions are also being normalized even for professional journalists, right? Because if you're reporting on conflict or you're reporting on a disaster, you are a person and therefore you have emotions, so that we've observed this affective turn where even journalists increasingly find it useful and find it acceptable to talk about, what they're feeling and not just what they're seeing, which is traditionally seen as the task of journalists. But here, because this is happening to citizens, and because these are ordinary citizens who are doing this journalistic work, right, they rely, they believe that their emotions are important, and they believe that, emotions have mobilizing power. And of course, emotions can be negative and positive, and increasingly we're seeing that both negative and positive emotions are being promoted as acceptable, right? So essentially, what we're doing is we're seeing citizens negotiate this affective proximity, right, which is often in journalism seen as something detrimental, right? If you're too close emotionally to something, you can't talk about it in an objective way. But here we're seeing that emotions and being emotional, right, is actually something that is constructive because it allows citizens to circumscribe the life-risking media practices, right, when you go to film an explosion that just happened. And also, makes your emotional labor of a citizen or a citizen journalist acceptable, right? Because it negates this imagined space that usually exists between a journalist who's trying to be objective about covering an event. And it might still seem like, oh, well, they're too emotional about it, so we can't rely on what they're saying. But nonetheless, I think this work is happening, in real time, where this affective proximity becomes more acceptable and it becomes kind of seen as part and parcel of covering conflict and covering war. And the other reason why I think we know why citizens are often compelled to engage in these media practices and report and explain what is going on in the conflict is this idea of being close to violence, where you yourself as an observer or as a participant of the events are traumatized, but you're also compelled to report and to explain because you can explain both what is going on and also what it feels like. So this has become, I think, very important as the conflict has unfolded. And of course, a big part of citizen media practices is also because citizens feel empowered to engage in these media practices because it allows them to negotiate unequal power relations, right? Because they often feel like they don't have enough power compared to, say, traditional journalists or government officials to make statements about how the war is affecting them. But it also allows them to shape boundaries, right? To say that I have a right as a Ukrainian citizen to report on this and to explain what's happening. Maybe somebody else who doesn't understand the local context doesn't have the right or can't report in as convincing a way. And so I think the affective component here is very important to take into account. So if we get into the actual citizen media practices themselves, there's a wide range of different practices that I and my fellow social scientists have observed even throughout the past 5 months. But also, of course, my observations are also informed by the fact that I've been studying digital media and protests in Ukraine and in the region for many years. So of course, some of the core media practices are, the traditional sort of journalistic issues like framing and agenda setting, where the citizens engage in creating messages and spreading messages, trying to explain not just what is going on, but also what the war is about, why it started, why it is happening, who is involved. So to try and put, to give more context to everything that is happening, to provide deeper background. The other important aspect of media practices is that citizens are contributing to creating a vocabulary of war, right? There is a certain type of, vocabulary, different terms that are used, and those terms are often contested. And so citizens are engaging on social media in linguistic articulation, trying to explain, why you should use this word to describe what's happening, but you shouldn't use a different word. So for instance, they say, don't say the Ukraine crisis, say Russia's war in Ukraine, right? And thereby, in building these vocabularies, they're also engaging in a kind of corrective communication, where they're saying, this is how you should talk about it, and you should listen to us because we are citizens of this country directly affected by this war. So there's been a lot of this corrective communication and this vocabulary building work, and I'll show you a few examples in just a second. Of course, alongside framing and agenda setting, some people take it upon themselves to also provide historical and political context. So again, they put the events that are happening right now into a much longer history, where they explain like the legacies of Russian colonialism, of the Soviet colonial policies, and even the pre-Soviet colonial policies, and histories of conquest and violence. And they draw here, obviously, on historical records, but they also draw very often on their family history, which makes these media practices more compelling, because they're not just saying, oh, well, in this textbook, this renowned historian says this, but they're also saying, there is a history of, for instance, Russia using hunger as a weapon of politics and a weapon of colonialism, and not just in Ukraine, but also in other post-Soviet countries, and they give examples. And then they talk about their own family history, because obviously some of this history is quite recent, it's like the last 150 years. So a lot of people have family stories and family histories of family members being subjected to these legacies. The other important work that media practices do for citizens is that they allow people to assign blame on responsibility. And again, this is very much a discursive media practice, so a lot of these things are worked out in discussions on social media, where people make different points about who exactly should be blamed for the fact that this war is happening, right? And they talk about collective blame and individual blame, but these discussions are incredibly lively, and they're happening on a daily basis, right? So it's very important, because obviously, if we look at traditional media, there is a certain way that media tend to frame conflicts, and they tend to frame, whose army it is. Is it Russian army, or is it Putin's army? Is the president to blame for the war, or are ordinary Russians to be blamed for the war? And again, these discussions are much livelier, and they're much more mobile and much more transformative on the grassroots level in citizen social media. The next thing that I think for me is an important component of media practices is citizens play the role of watchdogs, which again, traditionally is played by mainstream journalists, but here they use their media practices to hold the power to account, right? And this doesn't just mean that they're talking about holding, the Russian government to account for attacking Ukraine, or say holding certain Ukrainian officials to account for being corrupt, but they're also holding other actors to account. They're holding platforms to account for being really bad at moderating content during the war. They're holding corporations to account for, say, continuing to do business with Russia for, even though there are massive sanctions. And they're also holding other citizens to account for all kinds of things, for sharing, for instance, videos of missile attacks too soon, because that's dangerous. And if you share a video of the exact spot where a missile attack happened, the attack might happen again in a very short time. They're also holding other citizens to account for, for doing other things like doxing people or not sharing truthful information. So there's a lot of holding to account that happens, and I think it's really interesting to see how that develops as a kind of genre of media practices. Of course, I've already mentioned witnessing and personal testimony. I think this is one of the most powerful media practices that we've observed, because it relies on people's personal storytelling. And obviously on social media, we know personal stories tend to travel further than a lot of other types of information. And again, what we've seen in the war is we've seen stories, Twitter threads, Facebook posts that are sometimes spontaneous. So somebody decides, they are brave enough to share their experience. Very often, it also becomes somewhat organized when one person shares something and then another person shares something in a similar format, and then it becomes a kind of flash mob. But this personal storytelling is really important, right? Because it adds that depth of individual experiences to traditional media reporting, and this is where we get all of these on-the-ground reports of displacement, occupation, loss, struggle, right? And so there's a range of different kinds of witnessing, of people who have had to leave the country, be displaced, or people who have had to move across the country, people who've lost their homes, people who've lost their family members, soldiers on the front line. So there's all kinds of testimonies, and I think for me, this is one of the richest media practices that I've observed. Of course, there's also things that we have become a little more accustomed to, such as open source intelligence and gathering evidence of war crimes and human rights atrocities, gathering data, identifying destroyed military equipment. All of this stuff is happening. Some of it is happening kind of in a more professionalized way, but there's also a lot of grassroots activity there. And then also crowdsourcing, which again has been, I think, quite prominent in the Ukrainian social media space even before the war and even before the start of the war 8 years ago. Crowdfunding has become a normal part of life for Ukrainian social media users. Yes, in this war, for instance, the government is negotiating with other governments and other countries for military assistance, but citizens on the ground are also crowdfunding for drones, for protective equipment, for flak jackets, for helmets, and all sorts of things. Also for humanitarian aid for displaced people. So crowdfunding has blossomed. There are lots of multiple platforms that people use to crowdfund. There's all sorts of things that people do to raise money, from, say celebrities selling, auctioning off some sort of memorabilia, like the Eurovision winners auctioning off the Eurovision prize, to, people using OnlyFans to sell nudes and crowdfund for the army. Like that has also happened. So crowdfunding, I think, will be one of the biggest learning experiences for the grassroots media practices and the effort here. And I'm sure that other communities in other countries will probably learn from our crowdfunding efforts and the creativity that goes into this. Of course, fact-checking is also important, and it's a big part of kind of the everyday, the everyday media practices. But a lot of the fact-checking is obviously done by media organizations or by media NGOs. And we also know that fact-checking after the fact that some kind of disinformation is spread is only part of the story. It's also important to pre-fact check, to put the facts out there before something is shared. And of course, a lot of this is also mutual support and agency. So people do engage in media practices just to comfort each other and to offer support and to offer care to each other. So that is also a big part of what's happening in the media practice space. And of course, also educating each other about how to protect your privacy online, how to avoid being reported by bots, and how to avoid complaints from social media platforms, how to protect your data, how to protect your identity, how to protect your account. All of those things are also happening. So it is a really multifaceted set of media practices. All of them are targeted, and they're all happening in this participatory war space, but they're all very, very diverse. So just some of the media forms. So obviously we have Facebook posts, Twitter threads, Twitter live spaces, YouTube videos. Twitter live spaces have become really, really popular, outsized popularity. We have some regular ones now that happen every week or even a couple of times a week that bring people together to discuss the war. Telegram is an incredibly popular platform for sharing person-to-person information, but also to provide, updates about, for instance, air raid alarms, whenever there's an air attack, but also to share useful information about, for instance, how to cross the border and what kind of documentation you need if you're displaced, or where to get help, or what the train schedule is. So all of those things now also live in Telegram channels. And of course, art, creating art, sharing testimonies, recording things as they happen, including attacks. And people are engaging in both creation and curation. So just some examples for you. So this is an example of corrective communication and trying to manage the vocabulary. So this is an image that's been one of many widely shared on social media. That basically says, here's how you should talk about the war in Ukraine. And this is, we're telling you this as Ukrainians. So you're saying you should name the war, you should name the aggressor, you should be deliberate, and you should avoid words that imply shared responsibility. I think this is a really good example of this vocabulary building. I think also this is another example of, a person reacting in a very emotional way. This is a volunteer that is very active in helping the military. This is testimony because she's sharing what she's feeling, but also she's providing a framing for those who may not be inside Ukraine to say, look, you should understand this is the kind of trauma that we're experiencing every day. Is that you always expect to hear sirens, you always expect to hear the air raid alarms, but in spite of everything you still try to live a life that is somehow close to the norm, but you can't. So I think this is a very powerful example here of this kind of message. Differential privacy is something I wanted to mention because I know, differential privacy is a term that is widely used in privacy studies, and it's usually used to describe platform affordances. But I think here, this is a good example of how people understand language on social media as a differential privacy tool, right? Because multiple Ukrainian accounts on Twitter, for instance, tweet in multiple languages, right? And so, on the left here, we have a tweet in Ukrainian where, just after a very large missile attack yesterday on a central Ukrainian city, which is far away from the front line, where multiple people were killed and dozens were injured. This person is saying, post news, she's writing in Ukrainian, but she's saying, post news with this hashtag, write tweets in English or Ukrainian, but better in English, show photos, tag politicians, thought leaders, media, storm the world. So she's explicitly saying, even if you're an account who usually tweets in Ukrainian, because that's your sort of usual MO, if you want to reach bigger audiences, you should tweet in English. And on the left here is another Ukrainian activist who's saying, he's responding to a commenter who's telling him, I can tell when you're really passionate or angry when you start tweeting in Ukrainian. Because this person lives in a Western European country and he usually tweets in English. But he tweeted something in Ukrainian, and then he responds and says, it tends to be for the Ukrainian audience with references to memes and events that are too long to explain in English. Right, so we can see this differential privacy in action through the use of multiple languages, even without relying on algorithmic logics or curation. But this is also evidence that Ukrainian citizens understand very well how privacy works and how context collapse works and how algorithms work when it comes to tweeting in different languages. So in conclusion, I hopefully have convinced you that understanding these micro-media practices is important because in a complex environment where the realities of participatory war mix with platform algorithms, state disinformation, mainstream media logics, we need to understand that these micromedia citizen practices are an integral part of how people participate in the war today. And they're also inherently political, they're purposefully affective, they don't shy away from being emotional, and they can also act as drivers of democracy, resistance, and resilience for citizens and communities impacted by war. And I think it's important to account for all of these diverse media practices because we really want to understand the motivations, logics, and principles behind these practices at the micro level, right? Not just the macro picture, not just the geopolitics, but how ordinary citizens' lives are affected and how how they're affected finds its way into how they engage in media practices on social media and outside of them, because this is integral to understand how the hybrid media system is changing, how the political environment changes during wars, and also the nature of participatory warfare, which we understand to be an assemblage of media practices, political relations, and power relations. And I think really my goal here is to foreground and highlight the really, really important role of citizens as drivers of democracy and as potentially also important actors who might allow us to bring those responsible for war crimes to justice, but also basically to provide a more than truthful account and a very accurate account, albeit an emotional account, of what the war is like, because that is very often something that people far away from a place where war is happening might not always be able to grasp. And I think these citizen actions are really, really important. With that, I will stop sharing. And I will be happy to take any questions.
Okay. So we have time for some questions, and we've got